Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. Thanks so much for being here. And before we get started today, I just want to say a massive thank you to everyone who has reached out with support for the podcast. The reaction has been phenomenal so far, like beyond anything I could have expected. And I really appreciate everybody who's reached out, sent messages, sent comments, things like that. So if you have any questions, concerns, comments, requests for topics in the future, my DMs are always open, as is my email. So send me a message. It's always nice to know that people are listening and what's resonating with people, because podcasting is a little bit of a strange medium. You're kind of talking into the void and hoping that what you're saying is landing with people. So I really appreciate all of the feedback. So today we are going to get into the topic of periodization in dance, or perhaps the lack of periodization in the dance world. So this is a term that is maybe not familiar to a lot of people within the dance world, but I think the concept of this will be familiar once we start to dive into it. So periodization is essentially the systematic planning of training cycles throughout a specific time frame. And so we're usually looking at like the course of a dance year. Generally, especially in North America, our dance seasons sort of run on like a year-round schedule, and they tend to follow the school calendar. So it's this sort of systematic planning out of training cycles throughout that time frame is what periodization is. And this will make a bit more sense as we sort of dive into it. But I just want to talk a tiny bit about background stuff before we get into kind of exactly what periodization is and how to sort of implement it within the dance world. So it is probably no surprise to anybody who's listening to this podcast that dancers are being exposed to higher and higher training loads throughout the year. So back when I was dancing, back in the day, we followed essentially a school calendar. Our dance started sort of September when school started here in Vancouver and went till June. And throughout that time, it really did follow the school calendar, and we kind of had the school break. So we had, a couple weeks off at Christmas break, we had spring break, we had those like school holiday breaks were also generally breaks from dancing. And in the summer, we mostly had the summers off. We maybe did a week or two kind of like intensive or summer camps more than anything, but we certainly were not training year round. We definitely were not training for the entire summer. So that's a little bit different now than it used to be back in the day. So nowadays, it's incredibly common for dancers to be training literally like 52 weeks of the year. So dancers are still following a fairly typical school schedule where dance kind of starts at the beginning of September-ish and goes till the end of June-ish. But there's all these extra training opportunities. So we have like winter break intensives now, or extra rehearsals or private lessons and things like that. So it's rare for dancers to get like a full 2-week break around like the winter holidays. And same thing at spring, like during spring break or other school holidays, there's often extra training opportunities. Sometimes these are required, sometimes they're not, sometimes they're optional, but a lot of dancers are participating in these. And then when we come to the summer, again, a lot of dancers are dancing throughout the summer. There's so many phenomenal training opportunities during the summer, and all of these different intensives you can go to, and workshops and opportunities to train with different people within the field. So I understand where the allure is in wanting to participate in all of these, but it's coming at a cost, and that cost is not actually having a break from dance. So dance has really become a year-round activity as opposed to something that's like a little bit more periodized or a little bit more has kind of like an in-season or a season. I will say that this is not unique to dance. So we're seeing this in other youth sports. So things like baseball, hockey, soccer that used to have like really defined seasons where like at least in Vancouver, soccer was kind of a fall sport, and then maybe kids played hockey through the winter or basketball or some other sport, and then baseball was a spring sport. So you really had seasons, and you were playing multiple sports throughout the year that lasted for, 3 months, 4 months, however long that season was. And now, really, there's opportunities for kids to play all their sports year round. And so we have sort of spring baseball, but then there'll be summer ball, and then there's fall ball. And so it really is becoming much more year round in all sports. And I'm not going to dive into that too much on this podcast because we are focusing on dance, but I will just say that this is not a problem unique to dance right now. It is definitely a larger issue within society that we are starting to try and train our kids year round or overtrain our children, as the case may be. And I think a lot of that comes from like a fear of missed opportunities if they're not participating because other kids are participating and maybe they're going to continue to improve. And there's all sorts of reasons behind it. But this sort of year-round training is different than what used to happen in the dance world. So not only are dancers dancing longer throughout the year or having less breaks throughout the year, but their training loads or their schedules are increasingly saturated as well. So again, when I was dancing, we were dancing a high number of hours in a week, I would say, like compared to other dancers in the area. Like we were definitely training at the upper end, but we still had days off and we still had sort of like rest days and things like that. So when you actually like kind of look at the schedule of like what I was dancing back in the day versus what young dancers are dancing now, their schedules are much, much more saturated. And a lot of that comes from extra rehearsals and especially extra private lessons. That was not nearly as significant a phenomenon when I was dancing. We didn't do a lot of private lessons. Everything was kind of done within class time. And even when we were working on solos and stuff, we were usually doing that in more of a group setting. So we were having like a lesson and each of us would be working on like individual solos and we sort of run it like as a group, if that makes sense, as opposed to having these extra private lessons throughout the week. So kids' schedules are just more saturated. There's more stuff that goes on weekends. And again, some of this is like conventions and master classes and workshops and things like that. Or right now, because it is the fall season, it's November while I'm recording this. And so we have all these like extra Nutcracker opportunities. And so maybe your weekends are full of Nutcracker rehearsals and performances right now. So schedules are just generally more saturated throughout the year. And then we're having less time off throughout the year as well. So this is where periodization becomes really, really important because we know that the higher the training loads are that dancers are exposed to, the higher their risk for injury is. So we want to look at what can we do to mitigate some of these risks with these sort of training loads and with these training cycles. So like I said, periodization is just the systematic planning of these training cycles throughout a specific time frame. And this is used really, really commonly in sports. So this is an idea from sort of sports science or sports medicine that I think we can really be drawing on within the dance world. And as of right now, we really do not capitalize on this, especially in sort of like a community dance studio setting or a competitive studio setting. There are some professional dance companies that are starting to look at some of these ideas behind periodization. I wouldn't say they are being widely implemented, but there are examples of companies that are starting to look at this in terms of like what their seasons look like. But definitely in the wider dance industry and sort of like, competitive dance studios or just community studios that make up the majority of the dance industry locally, these are not necessarily being implemented. So, like I said, this is an area from sports that I think we can really draw on. And so, my background being in sports, I kind of dove into that a little bit in the first episode of the podcast. So if you haven't listened to that, you can go back and listen to sort of my background in working in sport and specifically working in rugby and things like that. And there's ideas from the sports world that I think we really, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel in dance, we can really just draw on their sort of expertise and their knowledge, and periodization is definitely one of them. So the goal of periodization is, like I said, to systematically plan our training, but the ultimate goal is so that we reach our best possible performance at the most important time of the year. So like we'll often call this the peak. We want our dancers to be able to peak at the most important time of the year. And that's going to be different depending on whether, again, you're a professional company or whether you're a competitive studio. It's going to be different depending on what you want to peak for. So right now, again, it's November. We might be looking at the Nutcracker as a peak in somebody's training cycle. That might be what they are working towards. And we want our dancers to reach their best possible performance at this peak. So how do we go about doing that? We need to plan cycles around it. So what we don't want is to have dancers sort of overtraining, potentially getting burnt out, getting injured at the time when we actually want them to be able to peak. So their peak being a performance or a competition or what have you. So we break up our training into kind of training cycles or into phases. And these terms may be familiar to you. Again, if you follow sports at all, you'll often hear about this like in like sports coverage if you're watching sports on TV and stuff. So we break them into phases, and the phases are usually a preseason phase, an in-season phase, a postseason phase, and an off-season phase. And I'll get into each of these in a little bit more detail. But we sometimes are familiar with that terminology of sort of preseason or off-season or things like that, because you'll hear that referred to in sports. So preseason is really our preparation phase. So this is the phase where we're starting to slowly and gradually ramp up the amount of like training that we are doing. We're starting to gradually build up dance-specific strength and conditioning. And it's really a time to focus really on technique in dance. So the preseason or preparation phase isn't where we want to be trying to, throw our biggest tricks or really, like drill choreography and do everything full out all the time and things like that. It's really a foundation. And so we're looking to gradually build up our sort of base and, like I said, dance specific strength and conditioning, and then really hone in on our technique. This is probably the sort of cycle or phase within periodization that the dance industry misses the most. Well, arguably also we don't have an off season, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But what often happens is, especially when we think about like September and going back to dance, if that's when your dance year starts, is we know teachers will often, and even dancers sort of know like, okay, I haven't danced in a little bit. I've had some time off maybe, hopefully. And so they know to kind of slowly, gradually get back into things for like, I would say the first week of dance, or maybe we see it happen for the first 2 weeks where teachers will kind of take it a little bit easier on dancers. And then after that, it seems like things just like absolutely ramp up exponentially, and it's straight back into, okay, choreography, let's like learn new skills. Let's really challenge your, boundaries and things like that. And really, for a preseason to be effective, it needs to be a lot longer than that. So I always tell my dancers and teachers that I work with that we really need our preseason to be at least 6 weeks and maybe even closer to 8 weeks. So in Canada, again, school usually starts right after Labor Day. That's generally when the dance season starts. And our Thanksgiving is earlier. Our Thanksgiving is in October. It usually falls like around maybe like the 10th of October, sort of like that mid-October area. And so that's often like a nice kind of like, I don't know, mental landmark to think of like, okay, everything that happens from the beginning of the dance season up till like Thanksgiving really is our preseason. So we really want to still be gradually building things up, going back to technique basics, really looking at, okay, where are we at strength and conditioning wise? How can we start to make this more dance specific, dance applicable, get our dance muscles working again? And that period, like I said, needs to be at least 6, if not closer to 8 weeks. And where I really see this missing the mark is just the length of time. Like I said, it seems like a lot of teachers sort of recognize the need for that slow, gradual buildup, but only really implement it for the first week or two of classes, and then it's kind of like off to the races. So after our preseason, we move into what we would consider like in season. And this is like the bulk of our season. So if you were, again, in a sporting landscape, this would be like the competitive part of your season. This would be like when you have competitive games or matches or what have you. And so for dance, this is the bulk of our season. And we're going to have performances, potentially competitions, conventions. All of that is going to be kind of spread out throughout our in season. The goal during in season, or when we are in season, really is a to find a balance between rehearsals and our cross-training or our conditioning. So if we're going through a period of time where, again, kind of leading up into the Nutcracker, maybe rehearsals are ramping up, that's becoming like a little bit more demanding, we're probably backing off a tiny bit on our cross-training or our conditioning. That's not to say we're eliminating it completely. It's still important to keep during our in-season, but we're not necessarily trying to push the envelope in terms of like conditioning when the demands of dance are high. And then we might find that if we get into January, Nutcracker's over, there's not a lot going on until maybe March or April in your season, or, later in the spring, we might have a little bit of a lull where the dance demands are slightly less. That might be a time where we look at, okay, now can we ramp up some of this conditioning stuff a little bit during that time? So it's really trying to find that balance of sort of demands of dance with the demands of cross-training, and really when one of them's a little bit higher, the other one's going to be a little bit lower, and vice versa. In terms of like our kind of conditioning or cross-training in the in-season, this isn't necessarily when we're trying to make a lot of gains. I mean, some dancers will, and some dancers might need to focus on this during season, but it's really more about maintenance during in-season. So the things that we're doing for conditioning and things like that, we're really looking at it from like a maintaining fitness perspective and not necessarily looking to gain fitness, because the demands of dance are going to be high at that time. And during the in-season, we also will look at like what we call micro cycles. So, okay, do we want to peak for specific competitions during in-season or specific performances, like I sort of alluded to before? Maybe the Nutcracker is one of your peaks during your in-season, but then maybe you also have a competition later in the spring that's going to be another peak. So we might look at these kind of like micro cycles within it. If this is something that you're interested in learning more about, and I'll link this like in the show notes and kind of talk about it a bit more at the end, but I did a webinar last spring, I believe it was, that was specifically about periodization and programming. So really applicable to like studio owners and teachers who have a say in like how a schedule is built out throughout a dance year. And we really got into like the nitty gritty of, okay, how do we actually like logistically go about figuring out like where these cycles fall within the years. So if you are interested in that in more detail, like I said, I will link it in the show notes. The replay of that webinar is available for purchase on the website. And it really like walks you through step by step how to actually implement this, because it does get a little bit complicated when we start to look at these like micro cycles within the in-season. So for the purposes of today, we just want to remember that in-season is going to be the bulk of our season, and it's really looking at that balance between sort of trying to balance performance, rehearsal demands, like dance demands, with kind of our conditioning and cross-training demands. We move from our in-season into our post-season, and our post-season is the time like immediately following in-season. So this is going to be like as soon as your dance year ends, whether that's like a final recital at the end of the year or your last competition or what have you, post-season follows that immediately. And the goal of post-season is literally just rest and relaxation. It is a time where we want to be doing like nothing dance related. And I generally recommend that our like kind of postseason be at least 2 weeks long. Like we really want to have a nice break after the season and all of like the stresses and demands of the season, where we just have a sort of 2-week break where all we're focusing on is rest and recovery. And that can include active recovery. I'm not suggesting that you have to just be a sloth on your couch for 2 weeks, although if that's what you need to do, then absolutely, there is no harm in that for 2 weeks at the end of your season. But it can include active recovery things like maybe some restorative yoga or walking or, easy cycling, things like that. But it's not going to include dance-specific activities during that 2 weeks. And this is maybe one of the hardest parts of periodization to convince dancers of. A lot of dancers have a lot of fear around taking 2 full weeks off of like no dance specific things, like where they're literally just focusing on rest and recovery. A lot of dancers think they're going to lose a lot of flexibility, they're going to lose strength, all of these things, but we know that that's not true. And in fact, there's actually research that supports that people, after they have a break, and depending on how long those breaks are, when they come back, we actually see increases in things like flexibility and strength, even though they have not worked on those during that break, because we're seeing those increases in kind of recovery, and we see those show up as like physiological improvements. So our postseason, like I said, we're doing nothing, we're resting, we're recovering, and then we move into our off season. And again, this is the time of the year where we want to be really taking a break from dance primarily, but this isn't necessarily the time of year where we're sort of being a sloth on our couch. So during the off season, I think there's a bit of a misconception that people think, oh, off season is just like complete rest, but that is our post season. And off season is where we really want to be focusing on base levels of training and really just focusing on general fitness. So if we have a dancer who needs to improve on their cardiovascular fitness, or they need to improve on their strength, or we're looking to improve their power for jump height, or any of those kind of physical fitness parameters, your off season is really when we want to focus on those. So we do not necessarily want to be doing nothing during our off season, but we don't necessarily want to be doing dance specific things. So your training in an off season is going to look much more like cross training or conditioning or those types of activities, because this is our best chance to build our fitness, our general fitness base before we move into the next preseason. So when we think of periodization, we really want to think of it as like a cycle, basically. So we start I started with preseason. You could start at any point in time with this, but we go sort of from our preseason to in-season to post-season to off-season, and our off-season leads right back into the next preseason. So if you remember back to preseason, we were talking about that being a time to build up more dance-specific strength and conditioning, whereas in our off-season, we really want to just build up general strength and fitness, so more just like human strength and fitness, and really build that base. Because during the in-season, we don't have a lot of physical capacity left over to be improving or increasing these kind of conditioning parameters, and so we kind of are looking at more maintenance during in-season, and during the off season, we can really focus on specifically building these fitness parameters. In terms of dance, I always get asked, like, how long should an off season be? And this is where it gets hard to get buy-in from dancers, because in reality, we really need probably an 8-week off season to really be able to hone in and focus on these kind of like physical fitness parameters. And this becomes really tricky and problematic, because if you think of our kind of dance calendar again, and most studios, again, I'm sort of thinking about like in Canada or North America, we dance into June usually. And then if we have sort of a 2-week postseason where we're doing nothing, so maybe that takes us to the end of June, beginning of July, for us to then have a true off season, which might be, 8 weeks long, that's kind of all of July and August. And then we're straight back into preseason. So that works in theory, but in reality, those summer months are when there's all of these opportunities for dancers to attend like intensives and things like that. And so when we throw those into the mix, we start to run into problems of like, where does a dancer's off season land? Where do they just get a week in July and maybe 2 weeks in August, or maybe not even that much, and all of a sudden we've lost off season, and we don't have that at all. So this is something that the dance industry sort of as a whole, I think, needs to look at. Like, obviously summer intensives and those types of programming are not going to go away. They're businesses first and foremost, but also just in terms of the opportunities that they afford dancers, there's a lot of value in them. But how do we balance that with the rest of the year and the rest of a dancer's training cycle? Where do we put in their true off season? And if we look at other sports, like again, we're running into similar issues in other sports where like athletes, especially young athletes, are training year round. But if you look at some of the recommendations that are coming out, some of them are recommending off seasons of like a minimum of 3 months. And so this 8 weeks is really probably like bare minimum. But I realize that right now, if we're looking at really not having an off season at all, sometimes when I'm working individually with dancers to try and think about, okay, what are good options for you for like summer training and things like that, if we can even get 6 weeks of an off season, I'm sometimes okay with that, or sort of quote unquote happy with that, because it's better than what's happening right now, which is essentially nothing. So just one more concept that sort of ties into periodization that I want to touch on before we wrap things up. And that's this idea of tapering or deloading. And again, we see this in the sports world and like in athletics. The area you might like hear about it the most is definitely kind of like marathon runners or distance runners, where you'll hear about them tapering in the week or 2 weeks leading up to a race. So if somebody's training for a marathon, they are not doing their longest practice run the day before or even the week before their race. Their longest mileage is often like 2 weeks before their race goal. And then they spend that sort of 2 weeks in between their longest run and their like race day. They spend that doing what we would call a taper. So they're gradually decreasing their mileage to make sure that on race day, they can be at their best possible peak performance. So they're, conserving energy, focusing more on rest and recovery, focusing on fueling all of these things so that on race day, they can go out and perform at their absolute best. In the dance world, we almost do the opposite. So especially if we think of like competitions or shows as being the events that we are peaking for, we ramp up rehearsals leading into that. So, the week before, all of a sudden we throw in like dress rehearsals, tech rehearsals, extra rehearsals because this dance isn't clean yet, or all of a sudden we need to reblock something because there's a dancer missing or things like that. And if we look at the training loads leading up to our kind of peak events, oftentimes we're really, really ramping up or exponentially increasing those training loads. And that is super problematic. We really should be looking at kind of like deloading or tapering during those so that dancers can focus on rest and recovery. So when they go into these physically demanding events, whether that be a performance or whether that be a convention or a competition, they're actually going in at their physical best. They're not going in like depleted and burnt out and potentially injured and all of that. And so this, again, is a concept that kind of ties into periodization that right now we don't really use within the dance world, but really we should be. So I'm going to wrap things up there in terms of talking about periodization. Like I said, if this is a topic you're interested in, especially if you have control over dancers' schedules. So you're a studio owner or a teacher and you're kind of designing programs and looking at like the calendar in terms of, okay, what competitions do we want to register for next year? When are we going to put our shows? What are we going to have our dancers participate in? I really encourage you to check out that periodization webinar that is available on the website. I will link it in the show notes. Like I said, it really breaks down step by step how to actually build out your calendar. That webinar also goes into some considerations for other programming, like how to implement cross-training and things like that into your dance schedule. But the periodization piece of it is definitely helpful for breaking it down step by step and figuring out, okay, where do we put deloads in? How do we block for our peak event? How do we kind of develop these little micro cycles within a training cycle of the year? So I would encourage you to check that out. If you have any thoughts, comments, concerns, questions with regards to periodization and how to implement that into a dance schedule or your studio schedule, please reach out. Like I said, my DMs are always open. You can email me. I'm always happy to chat about this. It's definitely something that I feel like should and can be implemented much more effectively within the dance world. And if you are a studio who currently utilizes this, because I actually know there are a few studios who really do implement periodization within their kind of cycle, I would love to chat with you further about that to see like what that looks like and how you implement that. So feel free to reach out. Thank you so much for listening and have a great day.